Howdy, Ags. Great to see you all here for this very special presentation of in the International Affairs Speaker Series of the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs. A couple of years ago, at the annual gathering called the Lone Star National Security Forum here in Texas, among the LBJ School at the University of Texas, the Tower Center at SMU, and ourselves, we had a great presentation by our guest today, Andrew Preston. And I said to myself at that point in time, we got to get him here because I thought it was one of the best presentations on American foreign policy that I had heard in a long time. And so we're very glad to have you, Andrew, and we appreciate this great turnout. First, I wanted to thank Dean Card and Mrs. Card for being here today. We appreciate that very much. And we also appreciate our friends here at the George Bush Presidential Library making the Orientation Theater available. This event quickly grew out of the largest room we have in the Bush School to do it. So the library, as it always does, stepped in to assist us in putting this great event together. So Andrew Preston is a professor of history at Clare College and Cambridge University in the UK. Andrew is one of the foremost historians currently writing on American foreign policy, generally the whole sweep of American foreign policy, but also that particular nexus of how the domestic affects foreign policy. So he's especially interested in that intersection, the influence of domestic politics and culture, and particularly religion, the role that religion has played in American foreign policy. The talk that he made at Lone Star has now been published as a book, which is really making a tremendous impact on the field. The book is Sword of the Spirit, Shield of Faith, Religion in American War and Diplomacy. So you want to be sure and keep that in mind and look for the book and pick it up because it's really a terrific read on this subject. Andrew's also written on other topics in American foreign policy, including Nixon and the World, U.S. Foreign Relations 1969 to 1977, the War Council, McGeorge Bundy, the NSC in Vietnam, and other works. He has been widely published not only in the academic world, but also in the popular media, including such publications as the Boston Globe, the Toronto Globe and Mail, History Today, Religion and Politics, and a wide variety of influential publications on the subject of American foreign policy. He's won numerous awards for his scholarly work, and we are very fortunate indeed to be able to hear from him today, especially on this day of the last presidential debate, which is going to be on foreign policy, and at a time when our country and our foreign policy obviously confront a number of very important and daunting challenges around the world. So without further ado, let's give a great Fightin' Texas Aggie welcome to Andrew Preston.
Thanks for that introduction, Larry, that too generous introduction. I appreciate it. I sort of feel like I'm about to participate in a presidential debate, given the kind of the setting, and it feels it's kind of got that feel. As Larry mentioned, I presented an aspect of this work at the Lone Star Forum 3 years ago, and it was a great privilege and a great honor to have done that, and it was extremely helpful for me. And it was one of sort of the best academic initiatives or academic projects that I've been a part of, because it was so collegial, it was so intellectual. We discussed my paper and everyone tore it apart. We played tennis, we went to the swimming pool. It was just one of those all too rare but fantastic scholarly forums where people like me with a work in project or a work in progress rather, can really benefit from rigorous analysis, but also collegiality and camaraderie, and I've always been grateful for that. I'm also grateful to be here, and to all of you for turning out. This is a much larger audience than I had anticipated, and so I am grateful for you coming. And because you're all here, we've moved from the Bush School to the Bush Library, and there's nothing against the Bush School. I've presented there before, and I'm quite fond of the Bush School, but I've never been in a forum quite like this to speak at a presidential library with an audience such as this. So I'm grateful for that as well, and thanks to all of you for coming. As Larry said, I am going to sort of give an overview and one detailed example from my book, and I'd be happy to talk about others. The book, as Larry mentioned, is titled Sword of the Spirit, Shield of Faith, Religion in American War and Diplomacy, and it examines the religious influence on American foreign relations from the late 16th century to the very recent past. And the book has an epilogue that deals with George W. Bush and Barack Obama. And I'll return to them very briefly in a minute. But the main purpose of the book is to trace the historical evolution of the relationship between American religion and U.S. foreign relations, which I see as very deep and profound. But at the time, when I began writing the book in 2003, 2004, what was a mostly ignored relationship. In the past couple of years, when I've presented on my work, and I say I'm working on religion and U.S. foreign policy, people say, oh, what a topical subject. And of course, it is a topical subject. But one of the points I make in my book is that it's always been topical. There's almost never been a period of American history in which the religious influence in American foreign relations hasn't been topical, or at least hasn't been present. You wouldn't have known that from reading the historical literature, the secondary literature on American foreign policy, because most historians, the vast majority of diplomatic historians, had ignored the role of religion in foreign policy. It just wasn't there. Aside from some usual suspects like Woodrow Wilson or John Foster Dulles, diplomatic historians just completely ignored religion. Then came 9/11, which generated an immense amount of interest in the role of religion, not necessarily in U.S. foreign policy, although it did, but mostly generated an immense amount of interest in religion and world affairs, religion and international relations. 9/11 produced a lot of religious rhetoric on all sides, for better or worse, from American leaders, from people in the rest of the world, even from places where we wouldn't have expected it, like the British Prime Minister Tony Blair, who used extremely religious rhetoric to describe the conflict that was going on from 9/11 and the years that followed, and also used religion to explain how he would solve these problems. So 9/11 reintroduced. It's become a cliche in the literature to say that 9/11 reintroduced religion into the IR literature and the diplomatic history literature. It brought religion back in. And one of the points my book tries to make, and it's a point that other scholars have made as well since 9/11, is that it never went away. Religion never went away. It's just for one reason or another that I'd be happy to discuss in the Q&A. Scholars had ignored that role. Even after 9/11, when scholars and journalists and others began paying attention to religion and international relations, that attention was either very episodic, people would focus kind of obsessively on one particular topic, or it was sensationalistic and shrill and polemical. And a lot of times, of course, it was both. It was something on Israel or the religious right or Muslim fundamentalist terrorism. Some of those treatments were extremely good, and I've used them, and I've benefited a lot from them, but they were very narrow. And some of them were, as I said, polemical and shrill, and I didn't find them to be much use at all. So even after 9/11, this new attention that was being paid to religion and foreign relations, U.S. foreign relations, and religion and international relations, was to some degree unsatisfying, or at least unsatisfactory to me. By the same token, American religious historians hadn't paid much attention at all to foreign relations. And if you look through American religious history and you look in an index for World War I or World War II or Vietnam or something like that, if it's a book on that period, you'll usually see some entries, but they're sort of just a passing mention to something that happened in World War II that then affected American religion in some way. But American religious historians were also not really exploring the links between religion and foreign relations. They were doing sort of a mirror image of what diplomatic historians were doing. And the result was the growth of two enormous bodies of secondary literature, of scholarly literature on American religion and American diplomacy that were more or less distinct and didn't really talk to one another and didn't speak to one another, which I thought was a really strange situation because there are very few phenomena in American history and in American public life that are as important as religion and foreign relations. And there are a lot of studies that effectively link religion to race or economics or gender, capitalism, and so on and so forth. But for some reason, foreign relations was sort of held off to one side. This is where my book comes in, for better or worse, and it's why I've attempted to trace the roots of this relationship between religion and foreign relations back to the colonial era and carry it right up through to the very recent past. In fact, at the time, it was right up to the present. I argue that this was a consistent influence. Religion had a consistent influence on American foreign relations. It ebbed and flowed, to be sure. Sometimes in some eras there wasn't much of a religious influence, but it certainly was there. And sometimes there was a great deal of religion in American foreign policy. And it wasn't always determining religion, even when it flowed, even when there was a lot of religion in U.S. foreign relations. It wasn't necessarily the most important factor. But one of the big points of my book is that it was always there and that it was a consistent influence. And that ideas about religious liberty were especially prevalent. And in fact, a lot of the American thinking on how to effectively apply American religion to foreign policy deals with religious liberty. And a lot of the language that we have seen in the last 20 or 30 years is very similar in substance, if the rhetoric has obviously changed, but is very similar in substance to the kind of rhetoric we would have read about religious liberty and the world in the late 18th or early 19th centuries. The first 5 chapters of the book deal with the period up to 1791, so up to the Bill of Rights, from English Protestant ideas about religion, security, and empire in the late 16th century to the First Amendment separation of church and state. And I discuss that not as a topic in and of itself, because it's obviously hugely important, and there are whole libraries dedicated to the study of the First Amendment and the free exercise and establishment clauses. But I try and link those ideas to the practice of foreign policy, or at least ideas about foreign policy. At the other end of the spectrum, the last chapter of the book deals with Ronald Reagan and the end of the Cold War, and the epilogue deals with George W. Bush and Barack Obama, by placing them both in their very different ways, squarely within the history I've traced throughout the book. And I do make the argument, I try and leave Bush and Obama off to one side because I'm an historian, I'm not a political scientist. I can get away with just focusing on the history and trying to sidestep the present issues. And I did that because I didn't want, well, first of all, I did that. If you've seen the book, it's already long enough, and I think you'll agree with me that I didn't necessarily need another chapter on Bush and then another chapter on Obama. But I also didn't want the present to detract from, and the sort of the politics of the present to detract from an historical story that I see really is separate from today's politics. But the point in the epilogue that I do make about George W. Bush and Barack Obama is that they both, in very different ways, fit squarely within, they both rest just as easily within this tradition, this religious tradition of American foreign relations that I traced in my book. By using such a large sweep, chronological sweep, that is, I wanted to give a fuller account of the many diverse and often contradictory ways in which religion helped give shape to America's role in the world. In fact, the central premise of my book is that while religion provided many Americans with a cultural and ideological lens through which to view the world, a mental map, if you will, there was no one single religious influence, but many. And that through an endless series of arguments about America's role in the world, these influences produced a synthesis that pushed U.S. foreign policy in a highly moralistic direction. So one of the research questions I asked myself as I began the book was, why is American foreign policy so idealistic or moralistic, or whatever word you want to choose? It doesn't mean that hard-headed security and economic and strategic considerations are absent from American foreign policy, of course. Nobody would ever argue that. But it is notable that American foreign policy, at least, is known by its reputation for being very idealistic and very normatively driven and very values driven. And that was one of my research questions. And sure enough, I argue in the book that religion is not the sole part of the answer, but is a large part of the answer of why American foreign policy has been more idealistic than that of other countries, than the realist tradition, the realpolitik tradition that has been predominant in Europe. For this reason, the book is entitled Sword of the Spirit, Shield of Faith, which comes from the cobbling together of two phrases in Paul's epistle to the Ephesians on how to be a proper Christian, when Paul was telling the early Christians what it took to be a proper Christian. Now, Paul didn't put those two phrases, Sword of the Spirit and Shield of Faith, together. They were in separate verses, but I've put them together because it captures perfectly what my book is all about. I use these phrases not only because several American foreign policymakers invoked them to explain their foreign policy, including Woodrow Wilson and John Foster Dulles, but because they convey the book's core argument that the religious influences made American foreign relations unusually moralistic, normative, and values-driven, both in terms of war, the sword of the Spirit, and peace, the shield of faith, in terms of conservatism and liberalism, nationalism and internationalism, militarism and pacifism, exceptionalism and cosmopolitanism. And I try not to make an argument one way or the other in the book as to which side was right or wrong in a particular debate. My only concern is to show that religion was a strong factor in these debates. So the religious influence wasn't unidirectional, it wasn't consensual, it wasn't static, it wasn't monolithic. I have two main approaches in the book in explaining how and why religion has influenced the conduct of foreign relations. One is fairly obvious, or it would seem to be a fairly obvious technique, and that was to look for American foreign policymakers who themselves were religious. So the book takes, in part, a very top-down focus of policymaking elites, presidents, secretaries of state, diplomats, and so on and so forth. And this is unavoidable, of course, for anybody who wants to study U.S. foreign policy. If you want to study policy, you have to study the policymakers. And so I looked for policymakers who themselves, at least as far as I could determine, were religious themselves and used religion in their foreign policy. The other approach I took was more bottom-up, and it's fairly new in my field of American diplomatic history, well, new in the last 20 years or so. It's a more social and cultural approach to look at what ordinary, non-policy-making Americans, but religious Americans, thought of U.S. foreign policy, and then particularly what they did to lobby their congressman or congresswoman or the Secretary of State or the State Department or the White House to do on a particular aspect of American foreign policy. And I argue that politics, that democratic politics, was a sort of meeting place between these policy-making elites and a highly activist group of religious Americans who were really pushing from the bottom up, pushing the government on the bottom up to move policy in one direction or another. Policymaking elites, even if they were very religious, didn't often agree with this popular pressure that was bubbling up from below. And so I argue that, and I trace through the book, the religious influence is a product of negotiation between policymaking elites and also this broad swathe of religious Americans who felt very concerned on a particular issue, be it the fate of Soviet Jews in Russia, or the fate of Protestants in South America, or ecumenical Protestants in the late 19th century and early 20th century who wanted to set up some sort of international organization. Ecumenical Protestants in the late 19th century were among the very first, I argue in the book, among the very first architects of the League of Nations, and later were absolutely instrumental in setting up the United Nations, in taking their ideas from ecumenical Protestantism and applying them on a geopolitical level. Common to both these groups, the sort of top-down policy-making elites and the bottom-up, wider popular influence, is that religion helped shape perceptions of the wider world. It didn't tell people what to do. It didn't sort of, there's this caricature that if you say you're working on religion and American foreign policy, it's that, oh, God told a politician or a diplomat or a preacher or whoever, God told them to do this or told them to do that. And if you don't find evidence of God telling somebody to do something, then there is no religious influence. But I argue in the book that it's more productive to think of religion as a very powerful cultural factor, an intellectual factor that helps shape perceptions of the wider world and helps steer a policymaker or anybody else in a certain direction. We have to be careful, of course, of speaking of individual belief. and of linking individual belief to behavior, because ultimately there's no way of us knowing what somebody actually believed or really believed, or whether they were sincere or whether they were not sincere. It's difficult, if not impossible, to speak with any certainty about what people actually believed, because there is ultimately no way of knowing. These are interior worlds to which we'll never have access. And religious sociologists and anthropologists, ironically enough, in religious studies departments, are, it's now in fashion to say that, well, because we can never determine with 100% proof what somebody really did believe or really didn't believe, then therefore we can't link it to behavior, such as political behavior or foreign policy making. And I find that approach to be actually rather limited. It's not my interest to say whether John Foster Dulles really believed what he was saying. As historians, I argue the best we can do is examine the manifestations of belief, both public and private, to look for inconsistencies and regularities, or for inconsistencies and irregularities between public behavior and public deed and private thought. In other words, did policymakers take religious ideas, observances, and other manifestations of faith seriously? Was their public use of religion consistent with their private faith? Did they make religion a central part of their life? Was it part of their policymaking? And the answers I found, at least I argued in my book, are sometimes surprising. For example, I argue that the foreign policies of some of the most personally devout presidents, such as Jimmy Carter, were not as religiously motivated as we might assume. And I have a very, very brief section on Carter in my book. Then there are those like Woodrow Wilson or John Foster Dulles or Ronald Reagan who were clearly religious and whose religion clearly, I would argue, influenced their worldview, but in ways that historians have not fully appreciated. And I think actually historians have misunderstood Wilson. I mean, Wilson sort of on the margins. They've misunderstood Wilson on the margins. But I really think historians have done a disservice to John Foster Dulles or Ronald Reagan, certainly when it comes to how religion influenced their foreign policies. Other figures such as Richard Nixon professed a great religiosity professed a great religiosity while almost entirely ignoring it in the making of their foreign policy. And there is where I found inconsistencies to be actually quite telling. Somebody who was very pious in public was actually not very pious in private at all. And there are no religious fingerprints, if you will, on Richard Nixon's foreign policy. That's not to say that that made Nixon's foreign policy better or worse. I'm not making a normative claim or a judgment claim here. I'm just looking for religious influence. Then there were others, and these were the most interesting stories, at least to me in writing the book. There were others who are not normally thought of as personally or particularly religious, such as Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, or George Kennan, who did regularly turn to religion in making their foreign policy. And here we see religious fingerprints all over FDR's foreign policy, or George Kennan's devising of containment in 1946-47. That's not to say that religion was the most important factor in FDR's foreign policy or in George Kennan's framing of containment, but those were factors that are certainly there and that historians have almost entirely ignored. So in this sense, my book is an exercise in historical recovery. Revisionism, yes, but I think a more appropriate word is recovery, for I've come to believe that we've misunderstood the religious backgrounds of key figures. And I'd like to take some time now in sort of midway through my lecture to speak in a little bit more detail about a particular example that's not often remembered and not known to a lot of people, and that's of President William McKinley. McKinley is, as I'm sure you all know, was president in the late 19th century from 1897 until he was assassinated in 1901. He was a Republican president, and he's gone down in the historical literature as being a sort of a friend of big business, as a sound money Republican, as somebody who turned his back on the establishment of Jim Crow as it was taking root in the South in the 1890s, and who kind of gave a nod and a wink to the South to go ahead and implement segregation. And he was also president at the time when the United States fought its first major global war in 1898-99, the Spanish-American War in Cuba and in the Philippines. And the war with Spain ended in 1898. It was over very quickly. This was John Hay's splendid little war. It ended very quickly with the United States dominant in Cuba, the Spanish were kicked out, but also in possession of Manila and by extension the rest of the Philippines. And not only McKinley, but no other American, or very few other Americans, actually knew what to do with the Philippines. The Philippines was a bit of a sideshow to the Spanish-American War. The U.S. fleet sailed to the Philippines to knock out the Spanish fleet as a sort of theater in the war that was really over Cuba and fought, and Puerto Rico also, but mainly over Cuba in the Caribbean. And the idea was to knock out the Spanish fleet, to really hit the Spanish as hard as possible and make them sue for peace. Except for a handful of people, the idea was not to take the Philippines as a colony. But when the war was over, American policymakers, especially McKinley, were faced with the decision, what do we now do with the Philippines? And it was an incredibly difficult decision. It was intensely controversial at the time. We can think back to 2003 or 2004 and think about controversies over the Iraq War, or we think back to the 60s and we think about Vietnam. But the controversy over the Philippines in 1899 was, I would argue, as intense, if not more intense, than either of those controversies. So it was a difficult decision. It was incredibly controversial. Most imperialists, and they were called imperialists at the day, even most imperialists did not argue for taking all of the Philippines. People like Teddy Roosevelt and Alfred Thayer Mahan just wanted to take the port of Manila, which is one of the finest natural harbors, in Asia, and they didn't want to take the rest of the archipelago. And when the American negotiators sailed for Paris to negotiate with Spain the terms to the end of the war, they still didn't have any instructions on what to do with the Philippines. McKinley was, he was notoriously indecisive, and he still hadn't made up his mind as to what to do. Eventually he did make up his mind, and he made up his mind to take all of the Philippines and to make it an American colony, or what he decided to, using the euphemism from the time, he decided to annex the Philippines. And he explained his decision to annex the Philippines in 1899 as divine inspiration. In a meeting with missionary leaders from the Methodist Church, which was his own church, he said, quote, "I walked the floor of the White House night after night until midnight. And I am not ashamed to tell you, gentlemen, that I went down on my knees and prayed Almighty God for light and guidance more than one night. And one night late, it came to me this way. I don't know how it was, but it came. There was nothing left for us to do but to take them all," that is the Philippine Islands. "There was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace do the very best we could by them as our fellow men for whom Christ also died." Well, American diplomatic historians have never really believed that, and they never took McKinley at his word. This is in 1973 in a hugely influential article called Imperialism and Sincerity. A distinguished historian of American foreign relations and of international history took McKinley to task for being, well, insincere. And he said that religion obviously wasn't a factor. His religious ideals obviously weren't a motivation. Instead, he was just saying this as pious cover for something that was really about strategy or economics or imperial rivalry with Germany and Britain, and so on and so forth. And since then, even before, but especially since 1973, since this article by Akira Irie, almost all historians of this phase of American imperialism have agreed that religion was obviously a cover and that it had no applicability to what was happening in the Philippines. According to this view, McKinley wasn't motivated or even informed by religion, but by other factors, be they strategic, political, diplomatic, or economic. In this view, religion wasn't a false consciousness, but a cynical cloaking device to justify a decision taken for these other reasons, be they political, diplomatic, economic, and so on and so forth. And all those factors were certainly important in the decision to take the Philippines. I wouldn't say that any of those factors weren't important. They were all somewhere in the mix. But the point I'm trying to make is that so too is religion. And in fact, religion helps us, I argue in my book, it helps us explain better why McKinley took decisions that have, to historians since, seemed to be contradictory or paradoxical or hard to explain. And actually, I think the decision to take the Philippines was entirely consistent with McKinley's religious worldview. And other historians have missed this because none of them have considered McKinley's own biography, and they certainly haven't looked at his own personal religion. And when we look at McKinley's biography, we find a very different and, I think, telling story. McKinley was raised in an evangelical Methodist household in Antebellum, Ohio. He had an intensely devout Methodist mother to whom he was very close. And he recalled later in life that his fondest memory of childhood was of listening to Methodist circuit riders come and give their sermons and then talking about them afterwards with others after the preacher had gone. Like many evangelicals in 19th century America, benevolent reform, what was called at the time the benevolent empire, this sort of broad-based reform movement to make America a better society through prison reform, post office reform, all sorts of things, and of course abolitionism. So like many evangelicals, benevolent reform and not the pro-business policies he would later adopt brought him into the Republican Party. As a student, as a young man, he was president of the YMCA in Canton, Ohio. This was at a time when the C in YMCA meant everything, and it was an evangelical Christian missionary organization. McKinley fought in the Civil War, including at Antietam, regularly attended soldiers' prayer meetings, and participated in camp revivals. And he supported emancipation at a time when really in 1860, 61, 62, when really the only people supporting abolitionism and then emancipation were faith-based. They were either evangelical Methodists, usually, but also from other denominations, or they were Unitarians, different theological fellow travelers, to be sure. But they approached the question from a very moralistic, right and wrong, faith-based view. Whereas the free soil ideology of people like Abraham Lincoln were not in favor of abolition. They were not in favor of emancipation, at least in 1860-61. And not coincidentally, I argue, their free soil ideology did not have a whole lot to do with religion. McKinley favored radical Reconstruction after the war and black freedom and black suffrage, and was bitterly critical of the South's treatment of freed slaves. Also after the war, he and his wife Ida were leaders in the temperance movement in Ohio, when the temperance movement was more or less synonymous with evangelicalism. As a lawyer, McKinley represented miners' unions. As a congressman, he voted in favor of the Bland Free Coinage Bill and the Sherman Silver Purchase Bill. This is McKinley, sound money McKinley, gold standard McKinley, as a young congressman voting in favor of silver measures. And as a congressman, he also denounced Jim Crow as it was beginning to take root in the South in the 1880s. In other words, McKinley was an extremely devout evangelical Methodist in an era when evangelical Methodists were devoted to reform, from the antebellum benevolent empire and abolitionism to the social gospel of the progressive era. Methodists were committed to the notion of uplift. Now, this notion of uplift could often be paternalistic. It could be used in favor of arguing for things like imperialism. But it was a sort of gospel of uplift nonetheless. McKinley wanted to be a Republican president. He was a Republican politician. And so he moved to the right on race and economics, but in foreign affairs, he could still practice a form of progressive faith-based social control. So when McKinley got down on his knees and prayed for guidance about the Philippines, was he being insincere? Well, there's no way for me to prove definitively one way or the other. There's no way for anybody to prove one way or the other whether he was sincere or insincere, whether he really believed those things, because none of us can enter each other's minds today, and nobody can certainly go back over a century and enter the mind of William McKinley. But I would say, based on all the evidence we have of McKinley, that he was hardly being insincere. He often got down on his knees and prayed to God for guidance on almost any issue that was vexing him. Indeed, it would have been odd had he not got down on his knees and prayed to God for guidance over something as controversial and is also morally fraught as imperialism in the Philippines. And it was perfectly natural for him to embark upon a foreign policy grounded in notions of paternalistic Christian uplift. So when he said we want to civilize and Christianize them, we might find that condescending, we might find it paternalistic, we might not. The point that I'm trying to make is that it certainly helps us explain his foreign policy decisions at a very difficult moment. I also then go on to argue that McKinley's notions of Christian uplift were not unique to him and were shared by a large number of foreign policymakers of the era. And I lump them all together as progressive imperialists. And I play around with a lot of contradictory, or things that seem to be contradictions to us, certainly to us today. People like McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt, Elihu Root, Beveridge, Mahan, Strong, a number of other pro-annexation people from the time were progressive imperialists, and not coincidentally. They all shared this notion of faith-based progress and uplift. And then I go on to argue very briefly that this notion of progressive imperialism, of Christian progressive imperialism, also helps us explain how the United States governed its colony in the years that followed. The U.S. governed, I don't have time to go into it, but the United States governed the Philippines in a fair number of ways in a very different fashion than the European imperial powers were governing their own colonies in Asia. Let me sum up with a few general remarks. Religion doesn't explain everything in the history of American foreign relations. It may not even explain most things. And I've received some criticism, and I don't think it's entirely fair criticism, when people, I think, take a look at the length of the book and they say, well, he's saying that religion explains everything. I'm certainly not saying that. Many episodes in American diplomatic history, even very broadly defined, had little to do with religion. But it was a factor much more often than we've realized or acknowledged. Religion doesn't necessarily replace what we already know about the history of American foreign policy, but I do think it enhances it. I do think that it helps fill in a lot of the gaps, especially when we're trying to explain why a certain policymaker did this and why a certain policymaker did that, especially when it's hard to explain because it ran contrary to a lot of other things that we know about them. Religion doesn't trump the national interest. I don't think we'll find any cases in American foreign policy history where presidents or secretaries of state favored doing something because it went against the national interest, but they thought that it was in their religious interest to do so. What I do argue is that religion helps frame individual worldviews. It basically helps frame the context in which individuals make decisions, and it leads them to make a decision one way or the other, which I think is an important distinction, and it's also important for historians to examine those questions. So in other words, religion provides missing pieces of a puzzle. We generally know what the puzzle already looks like, but we're still missing a few pieces there, here and there, and we don't have the full picture. And by looking for these missing religious pieces, we can get a better sense of what the puzzle of American foreign relations actually looks like. Thank you.
We have time for some questions, so the floor is open, and Andrew will recognize your hands as you show them.
Yes, sir. So, to clarify, you would argue that religion has been more of a passive influence than an active influence on American policymaking? It's more of a structure in which decisions are made, or an influence on the structures in which decisions are made?
First of all, I love coming to Texas to speak because people call me sir, so that's thank you for that. That's a really good question, and you put it in a way that's quite incisive. Was it a passive or an active influence? And when you put it like that, passive or active, it makes it seem that religion is sort of in the background and it's never in the foreground and it was never decisive. I think there are moments when it had what we could argue as a decisive influence, or at least a religious episode, a religious idea was crucial at a certain moment in turning history. So I think that it could be. Can everybody hear me, or should I use the mic? Should I still use the mic? So, so when it was active, and even when it was passive, I guess, which to me connotes that it's a much lower order of magnitude category of analysis or explanatory factor. Even when it was passive, I still think it's important to be looking at those instances and at those people to see how their world, as I said, to see how their worldview is shaped, to see what decisions they're going to make. I have a couple of chapters on John Foster Dulles, and historians have spent a lot of time looking at Dulles's religion, and almost all of them have concluded that Dulles's Protestantism, his Presbyterianism, made him inherently hostile to atheistic communism, and that's true. I don't dispute that. But that's only scratching the surface of Dulles. He was a much more interesting man than the historiography suggests. That's not to say I think that Dulles is this always happens with diplomatic historians when I make this case. They say, "Oh, you're defending Dulles, or you're defending McKinley in the Philippines." Well, that's not my intention. It's not my point. And it's an interesting question, but it's something that I just want to leave aside. And so, a lot of times, Dulles did things that almost no other fellow Republican would support, or had a much more difficult time supporting. So he was a fervent supporter. Dulles was he was in San Francisco in 1945 to help set up the UN at a time when international organization was a dirty word to a lot of Republicans. Republicans were just coming out of their isolationist phase. Dulles worked with the Truman administration, again, much to the anger of a lot of his fellow Republicans, to set up NATO. Not that Republicans were against NATO, but it was a difficult question, but it was something that Dulles had no problem supporting against the wishes of his party. He was a firm supporter of European integration. Again, at a time when very few other Americans were supporters of European integration in the late 40s and 50s, even before there was a coal and steel community or there was a European Union. Why did he do this? Well, not coincidentally, I argue, Dulles gave up his lucrative law practice, his very lucrative Wall Street law practice, for 6 years at the height of his earning powers to work for the Federal Council of Churches on looking at, specifically investigating, ways to apply the tenets of the ecumenical movement to geopolitics. What were those tenets? They were that in order to mitigate and eventually do away with religious conflict, you bring denominations and eventually religions together under one umbrella organization, like the Federal Council of Churches, later the World Council of Churches. Ecumenism was central to Vatican II. So you bring different denominations together under one roof, and then applying that principle to geopolitics it's not a huge leap of logic. You bring then individual states together under one roof. Now, Dulles wasn't the first one to think this, but he spent 6 years of his life investigating how to apply these solutions. He was invited to the UN because of those efforts to help set up, invited to San Francisco to help set up the UN along those. So now, Dulles never sat down and said, "I'm doing this, I believe in the UN because of my ecumenical background." Is that passive or active? It's a tough one to nail, and I don't think it's either. It's not like ecumenism made Dulles do this, but I wouldn't say it's passive. I'm not sure. Sorry, that's a long-winded answer to a very good question, but it gets right at the heart of the whole enterprise of looking at something as, that doesn't always have concrete proof, like religion, and how do you then link that to something that usually does have concrete proof because of all the paperwork we have on foreign policy decisions, like foreign policy.
Yes, you talked about the influence of religion on the idealistic, moralistic strain in American foreign policy. One religious figure who seems kind of not to fit this mold is Reinhold Niebuhr, the theologian and foreign policy writer, who is generally identified with kind of the strain of American foreign policy and thinking in the early Cold War. And I was wondering if you could talk about him and his place in your narrative.
Thank you for that. So, Niebuhr was this incredibly influential public intellectual and theologian. He's better known as a public intellectual than as a theologian. I don't think his theology is studied much anymore in divinity schools. Well, it is, but he's not taken as seriously, for instance, as his brother Richard was as a theologian. But he was this towering figure in American public life in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And he was a realist. He was in foreign policy terms, he was a realist, and he decried American exceptionalism. He worried about what he said was Americans' tendencies to go off on ideological crusades. And he said we have to rein ourselves in more. We have to recognize our own limitations. And he did so through, we have to be humble before God. We can't just think we can remake the world in our image, and so on and so forth. He did believe in power, and he did believe in the exercise of American power. He thought that the only way you could exercise power, any country could exercise power, was with love, and with Christian love, that is, and with morality. And that would only come through some sort of moral code, some sort of like a religion. And for him, it was Christianity. And he said for the United States, it was the Judeo-Christian tradition. So Niebuhr fits in quite well in a lot of currents in American foreign policy. And I have a lot on Niebuhr. In the 1930s, he abandoned his pacifism and his Marxism, became kind of a centrist liberal on most questions, and a Democrat, and he had been voting socialist up till then, up till the late 30s. Abandoned his pacifism and started arguing very passionately and founded a magazine called Christianity in Crisis, solely for the purpose of encouraging American entry into the world crisis. Maybe not at first going to war, but certainly it was eventually. We need to go to war with Nazi Germany. In the early Cold War period, he was instrumental in building support for containment, but then just like Kennan, and who had the same, not just the same world, sort of secular worldview, but also a very similar religious worldview. Like Kennan, he helped set up something like containment, but then said, but we have to be careful. We can't let it go too far. We can't go, we can't go around the world in some sort of ideological crusade. We have to know when to pick our fights. And then Niebuhr was central in opposing the Vietnam War. He was one of the early leaders of the anti-war movement before it became a sort of radical or mass student protest movement. Because he said, yes, I still believe in containment, and I still believe that we need to resist communism in the Soviet Union, but this isn't where we should pick our fight. And a lot of that came through his worldview. So it's a complex story. It's not just, when I began the project in 2003, 2004, people said, oh, this is very topical. This is basically going to be, if you think of the caricatures of George W. Bush, that this will be the Bush story backwards, that it's going to be this story well, just think about all the sorts of caricatures that people had of Bush. And at the time I said, well, I don't think so. I think it's going to be more interesting than that. And I think people like Bush himself are going to be more interesting than that because they're not going to conform to the caricatures. And without exception rather, none of the people I've looked at, going back to the colonial era right up to the present, have conformed to those stereotypes. And so nobody fits into a neat and tidy box. And I think that's what makes the story so interesting.
You mentioned that some presidents and policymakers are more likely than others to inject religion into their foreign policy. Have you discerned any sort of trend on what would cause that, or is it just random?
I think it's random because it's individual. It depends on, part of it depends on historical context. When historians will be talking about our era over the last 30 or 40 years as, if not another Great Awakening, I think that's too much, but certainly as an era like the 1850s or the 1890s, early 1900s, or the 1950s, as an era in which religion was very much at the fore of national discourse and of public life. And so that obviously, has an effect. So somebody like John Hay, I very briefly mentioned John Hay when he called the Spanish-American War the Splendid Little War. Hay himself wasn't a religious man. I desperately wanted him to be religious when I began my research because it would have fit perfectly in with a lot of my arguments. But actually, I ended up arguing that, or believing that Hay fits some of my arguments even better because he wasn't a particularly religious man, and yet he did a lot on behalf of the plight of Jews in Romania and Russia, in petitioning the Russian and Romanian governments, in threatening them with sanctions, the sorts of things that we think are actually quite modern from the last 10 or 20 years or 30 years, which are all over the 19th century. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that he was in a very religious era in which religious groups, not just Jews, but Protestants and Catholics, were very active in pushing for their own rights. I have a story of Mormon missionaries in Europe who were being persecuted, and Hay, who didn't like the Mormons, in fact, couldn't find a diplomat who had in this era who had a nice thing to say about Mormons. Hay stuck up for their rights because he said they're not being persecuted for breaking a real law, a natural law. They're not stealing or assaulting anyone in Germany or France. They're being harassed for proselytizing and for preaching their faith, and they have a right to individual religious liberty worldwide. It's a universal right. And he's using the same language that we think of as very contemporary. He's using this language in the 1890s. And he stuck up for the Mormon missionaries. And that's the other, I didn't have time to sort of trace that side of the story up, but that's the other side of the story, is sort of these bottom-up groups pushing for either their own rights or the rights of their co-religionists in other countries, lobbying the State Department. And then in the case of the Mormon missionaries, Hay looked into it, the State Department looked into it, and they said, at the end of the day, the Mormons aren't doing anything wrong, as far as we can tell. They're just being harassed for being Mormons. And so the State Department then applied tremendous pressure on, this isn't neocolonialism in some, small African or Latin American country. This was challenging great powers in Europe over what the Americans were calling a universal right, which the Europeans said, no, this isn't a universal right. We have established churches, we have official faiths, we have these sects off to one side, like Mormonism, and eventually they bowed to State Department pressure. So so context matters greatly, but when it comes to individual faith, then it just comes down to, Hay worked with some very religious people, like Root, who was extremely religious, and he worked with Roosevelt, whose religion, I argue he was devout, but it was a very eclectic, eccentric type of faith. He sort of borrowed from different traditions and that sort of thing. So in that case, it does depend on the individual.
To what degree has religion played a role in our foreign policy towards Israel?
To what degree has religion played a role in the foreign policy towards Israel? Next question. I'm serious. Certainly. It's a good question. It's a politically fraught question. I think it's played a large role. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And again, I'm not talking about. I don't want to get into sort of I'm not saying you are, but my concern isn't to either praise or criticize Israel. Certainly, Christian, what's now called Christian Zionism, their support for Israel in the United States is important. I think that's where a lot of commentators stop. I think that it goes much deeper than that. I think that there is, and I talk about this in my book, that there's a very long connection in the American imagination to the idea of Israel even before 1948. So America was always called a New Jerusalem or a New Israel, and a lot of its first founders, Pilgrims and Puritans and others, identified with the ancient Israelites more than they did almost any other group. And they were persecuted in England before going to New England. They were persecuted under anti-Jewish laws, under anti-Semitic laws. That's not to say that whatever happened in the 17th century causes American foreign policy towards Israel today, but there's something very deep in the American psyche about the idea of Israel, and then after 48 with the nation state of Israel that is religious, it's cultural. It just goes very deep. And I said in a review once that I made this point in talking about these issues that the Washington Post a couple of years ago had a big story on the India lobby, that the India lobby was going to be the next Israel lobby because it was extremely well financed and it had its own AIPAC, I forget what it was called, and that it was very active in Washington, had all these great connections to American congressmen and senators and to the White House. And I said in the review, I just can't see it. I mean, no matter how well financed and well connected they are, I'm sure they'll be effective on certain issues for lobbying, but there's not that deep sort of automatic attachment that a lot of Americans, no matter what their religion is. Now, that's obviously a generalization, so it doesn't apply to all Americans. Then you have the explicitly religious reasons on top of that, Christian Zionism, American Jewry, whoever. And so that's important as well. But I think it's a religious, but it goes beyond, it's not just a religious issue, it's a cultural issue that is much harder to define, I think.
I'm mindful that many of you have class, either the students or faculty who are here, so maybe we have time for just a couple of more questions, one or two more questions. Let's say two.
Okay, two questions? Yeah. The post-war foreign policy establishment.
Post-World War II, you mean?
Yeah. You've got a lot of businessmen and WASPs, moving from the banking and business into the government, into public service. How much of that were you able to trace and see if that was something like that movement was predicated on notions of, I guess, on some kind of religiously based noblesse oblige?
Oh, right, like a notion of public service. Or that. That's a good question. I think for some people, I'm sure, but no. I mean, the short answer is no. I didn't find that. I wasn't looking for it. Perhaps if I looked for it, but I found a lot of things that I wasn't looking for, like the story of the Mormon missionaries that then led me in certain directions to make certain arguments. I didn't find anything like that. Not even among people you might see it in, like Dean Acheson, a Washington lawyer who is the son of an Episcopal bishop. again, I have very little on Atchison because I'm sure he was. I don't know if he was personally devout or not, but what I could determine, at least to my satisfaction, was there was no connection between his private faith, whatever it was, because he didn't write about it very much, and his public action. Whereas with Truman, it was a different story. I think that's an easier case to make, and a lot of other. I'm not the first historian to make that connection. But in terms of the business elite, the people like Dillon and McCloy and those sorts, and Averell Harriman, no. In fact, I have those three I just mentioned, and they're just the tip of the iceberg. Cyrus Vance, and the sort of establishment that would move from between Wall Street and Washington quite easily, or between New York and Washington. No, I don't have very much on them at all. Yes.
I realize this is outside the realm of your book, but could you talk about the extent to which others' image outside the United States is influenced by their perception of our religious behavior? And I'm thinking about the amount of individual travel by Americans historically that has been for religious purposes. Missionaries in China, trips to Jerusalem and Israel, the Holy Land, the Mormons work throughout the world. To what extent has that shaped others' view of American foreign policy?
It's a great question, and you're right. It's something that I didn't. In an effort to limit the project, I didn't look at others' perceptions of the United States unless they were directly relevant. So I do have, I do discuss the fact that Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek were both Christians, and they weren't just Christians, but they were Christians converted through American Protestantism, and others as well. And I discuss missionaries and their travel and that sort of thing. I don't really have a whole lot on the religions of others, and not very much on their perceptions. But I think it's undoubtedly important, and that Americans' religion, when they travel abroad, certainly, and a lot of, especially in the 19th century, as I think you were kind of implying, I don't have a statistic in mind, so I should be careful to say a disproportionate number of travelers were missionaries, but I think they were, or had some sort of religious purpose. And today the number of American missionaries working abroad is larger than ever. And they do a huge, as I'm sure a lot of you know, do an incredibly wide range of work in other countries. It's sort of not, there's this stereotype of the missionary as somebody who's just sort of relentlessly pushing a faith on somebody else, and that's all they're doing. But they're not. They're essentially, the American missionary movement today is like a parallel Peace Corps. And I think that has more. I've been surprised. I teach in Britain. I travel extensively in Europe and elsewhere. And among a lot of people, the notion, they identify America's religion as a kind of, like I said before about caricatures of George W. Bush, as a kind of crusader and crusading mentality and that sort of thing. But when you talk to people in Africa, for instance, the perception of American missionaries is very different, and the perception of America can be very different as well. I think I should probably stop there.
Well,
so thank you.
The trains run on time around here,
Yeah.
and we have a very strict class schedule, and many of you have to adhere to that. So we'll respect that. Thank you for coming out, and let's give a great applause. Thank you for